This is a CBS News special. The Burial in Abilene. Reporting from the CBS newsroom in New York, correspondent Walter Cronkite.
And this is Abilene, Kansas, boyhood home of Dwight David Eisenhower back at the turn of the century. That's the home he occupied with his brothers before he went off to West Point and to one of the most famous careers in American military and political history. He has returned there today. The body lies now aboard the funeral train at the railway station in Abilene, and in the next 2 hours will be borne from that railway station to the small limestone chapel where it will be buried in the floor in the last rites for Dwight Eisenhower. The train carried the body across the United States from the Monday funeral services in Washington as thousands gathered, some in little knots, some in large crowds, in the communities and towns across the nation through the night of Monday night, long through the day yesterday, and through last night until its arrival at 6:57 this morning in Abilene time. It was 9 hours late, the train in Abilene, because it had slowed to just 5, 6, 7, 8 miles an hour as it went through many of the towns. The engineer, fearful that the crowds along the tracks might crowd onto the tracks and cause a tragedy similar to that during the passage of the Bobby Kennedy funeral train from New York to Washington. The train did stop some places along the route as scheduled for changes of crews and to be switched onto other tracks, and Mrs. Eisenhower, the late president's widow, appeared on the back platform of the train twice during the evening, at Salem, Illinois at dusk as the train passed slowly through that historic town, and also at St. Louis as it paused there in St. Louis, and there she thanked the crowd, saying that I'm most grateful for all the expressions of love. She repeated that phrase 2 or 3 times to the crowd gathered in St. Louis, and David Eisenhower, the late president's 21-year-old grandson, 21 just yesterday, came onto the platform and joined his grandmother and said, I feel the same way. The baggage car, the second car of the 10-car train, draped in black under late orders apparently decided in the first evening of the train's passage after the Eisenhower family, which had requested no particular notice of this funeral train, decided that with all the crowds along the way, something should be done. And so Mrs. Gordon Moore, Mrs. Eisenhower's sister, and Mrs. John D. Eisenhower, Johnny Eisenhower, the daughter-in-law of the late president, left the train at Cincinnati and supervised the draping of the baggage car, old baggage car 314, in a black crepe with an American flag on the side. The 10-car special train was about 50 minutes behind schedule as it pulled out of Washington's Union Station on Monday evening. Its first stop was at Charlottesville, Virginia. The Eisenhower family had requested that there be no special observances at the stations, as we noted. The train would pass through those stations, however, but later there were people who turned out at several of the points along the train's route. General Eisenhower, resting in the baggage car in that simple $80 GI aluminized coffin with 5 servicemen from the various services as an honor guard in the baggage car. It was not opened anywhere, nor were there windows, of course, in the baggage car for people to see in, but it had been draped in black to form a sort of a room where he rested on the way out. He's dressed in his Army uniform, perhaps you have heard, with that famous jacket that he designed himself in England, London, the days before the invasion back in 1943. That has now become known as the Eisenhower jacket and is a popular form of military wear for armies around the world. He's wearing just 3 ribbons. He's probably the most decorated man ever in the history of military affairs, but he chose only 3 simple ribbons, and Navy and Army Medals of Merit. Let's look at the train arriving at Abilene this morning, just about 2 hours ago. And here it is. It pulled in to the freight station there, which is not actually used anymore, a small freight station over on this siding. A crowd of residents of Abilene out. There are some 8,000 persons in Abilene today. As residents, they're expected to be perhaps as many as 100,000 in the city today, including the President of the United States. Mr. Nixon, Mrs. Nixon, and Tricia Nixon left Andrews Air Force Base just about 15 minutes before this scene you see here, this scene having occurred just 2 hours ago. The Eisenhower family is and has remained aboard the last coach of this train, a car called the Santa Fe, which Mr. and Ms. Eisenhower have had as their private railway car ever since 1951, when he came out to Abilene on that same train to announce his candidacy for the presidency of the United States. They've used it for their many trips to Palm Springs, California, their home there, down to Augusta, Georgia. Mrs. Eisenhower doesn't like to fly, and the president acceded to her request that they go by train. These cars were occupied by trained personnel, executives of the railroad, military officials who were helping with the arrangements for the funeral, which actually, the details of which had been planned by Mr. Eisenhower 2 years ago. There were 10 cars on the train, no press aboard. George Herman is there in Abilene, Kansas. George?
Walter, there's been a problem with the weather here in Abilene this morning. It started out to be bright and clear and cold, and then it turned a little nasty, and then it turned a little warm, and as a result, there's been some confusion. The plans have been changed twice. It started out to be an outdoor ceremony here in front of the Eisenhower Library at the Eisenhower Center. Then it was moved indoors to the tiny auditorium, which seats only about 150 persons, as opposed to the larger area out here that can seat some 300 or 400. The whole ceremony, as you've indicated, will start at the railroad station, just not too far from here, not too long a time from here, except in the general's past. At the railroad station, David Shoemaker.
The funeral train has been waiting on this siding for a little more than an hour now, shades pulled down to ensure the Eisenhower family last few moments of privacy before the ordeal of the final public ceremony. The baggage car with the casket has been draped in black, an American flag on the side. In less than an hour, an honor guard once again will move into position. Once again, we'll hear the familiar ruffles and flourishes and hail to the chief. The casket will be carried from the train to a waiting hearse, and then the procession will move through the streets of Abilene to the Eisenhower Center. First, up Mulberry to 3rd, there to turn right at the Case home. Charles Case, a prominent Republican, longtime friend of Mr. Eisenhower, and his father used to delight young Ike with stories of the Old West. From there, the procession will move down 3rd to Main Street. Main Street of Abilene is called Buckeye. There have been parades along the way many times for Abilene's most famous son. He always remembered his first parade. He was 6 then, and he carried a torch in a political parade for the presidential campaign of William McKinley in 1896. As the procession turns again, past many people who've waited through the cold night to pay their final respects, the procession will pass near the siding where the funeral train has been standing, cross the tracks, and then, in just 4 blocks, approach Lincoln School. All the Eisenhower boys went to school here, played baseball in the schoolyard. Their home in the Eisenhower Museum is at the end of the block, and George Herman is waiting back there.
As the procession turns off Buckeye Street into the Eisenhower Center, it passes once again, Walter, the Eisenhower home, that small home that housed so many people, so many successful people, of whom Mrs. Eisenhower said when she was asked what she thought about her famous son, which one? Then it will move down the broad Central Avenue, which is the heart of this Eisenhower Center, towards the Eisenhower Library, where, as you can see, the seats are in place, the buses have been bringing troops in, and all is in readiness for the funeral ceremony, which will actually be held up on the steps of the Eisenhower Library. The whole center here is one large tribute to President Eisenhower's life and works. The library itself holding some 50,000 documents, a place of study already to scholars of American history and to students of the West, of Abilene, and of President Eisenhower himself. From the steps of the Eisenhower Library, the body and the procession will move down a flower-lined path to the chapel, as it is familiarly called in the background, although President Eisenhower himself preferred to call it a place of meditation. And inside there on a tablet is inscribed his inaugural prayer from his first inaugural, and just in front of that, recessed into the floor, a small plaque marking where his infant son Dowd was buried, Dowd who died at the age of 3. And just there, invisible to our cameras, President Eisenhower will be buried today. Walter?
He is reported to have said at one time back, about 4 years ago, I believe, George, to one of his friends, and the first revelation that anyone had of his funeral plans and burial plans, he said, Mamie and I thought it would be nice to be buried under the chapel instead of just having our headstones stuck up over our graves. That way, anybody taking the trouble to stop by would have a place to sit down. You know, it can get pretty hot in summer out that way, and plenty cold in the wintertime. George, have you or David Shoemaker heard of any plans for Mrs. Eisenhower after these services today? And going through the various reports here, I haven't seen any indication of whether she intends to reboard the train and return east, or what her plans are.
Walter, this is George. I have not heard any plans to be made for Mrs. Eisenhower. The Eisenhower family and the friends of the Eisenhower family here in Abilene have been making every attempt to shield the Eisenhower family from any kind of publicity. For a while, it was thought that perhaps the ceremony was going to be moved indoors for the pure reason that there the cameras would not be able to catch a glimpse of the face of Mrs. Eisenhower. So everything here in Abilene, as in any town where a funeral of an old and beloved friend is being held, every attempt is being made to shield the family, and nothing at all has been said about Mrs. Eisenhower that I've heard.
She has been bearing up exceedingly well, apparently. The family has all said that they're extremely proud of the way she has taken this terribly sad moment, of course, in her life, the ending of almost a half a century of companionship with General Eisenhower, the long years in which she waited while he fought this nation's wars, and the many, many months during which she has been at his side constantly through his last illness. One of the closest personal and professional friends of President Eisenhower was General of the Army Omar Bradley. He was General Eisenhower's chief of staff in the crusade through Europe. Yesterday, General Bradley visited the Eisenhower Museum at Abilene, Kansas. It was his first visit to the museum, which now receives close to 100,000 visitors each year. And they see behind glass and in pictures what General Bradley saw with President Eisenhower as it happened. With General Bradley, when he went through the museum yesterday, were General Andrew Goodpaster, who served in the White House as an aide to President Eisenhower and is to become the new commander of NATO forces, and the museum curator, John Wickman, and CBS News correspondent Ike Pappas.
Have you been here before, General? I didn't think you had.
What are your thoughts, General Bradley, as you look at some of these murals and look back on the life of General Eisenhower?
Well, of course, to me it means a great loss because he was such a close friend and we were so closely associated.
I think there's a lot more inside.
Yes, over in this wing, General, we start with the General Eisenhower's early life and his military career, and then winding up with a political career. Then on the other wing, President. And this old car that General Eisenhower used to court Mrs. Eisenhower in, Mrs. Dowd's 1914 R&L electric. And she saved it along with everything else and gave it to the museum. Yeah, there's a picture of him in there quite a while back. Yes, I believe it probably was the first car. And we put out the various items from the war, some of them bearing directly on General Eisenhower and some not. Some of the war souvenirs, usual sort of thing.
You got one in here that said Constantinople on it?
Let's see. I don't know if we've got that one in this particular case or not. We may well have. Its swords are a little hard to keep up with around this place. We've got...
The reason I ask, some of my men brought me a saber in Sicily. It had Constantinople on it. Across the hill, it had Eisenhower.
I see.
So I took it back to Ike at Algiers. He said, you lost your saber somewhere between here and Constantinople. And I explained to him. He said, unless it's Eisenhauer, it's not my answer. But it was H-A-U-E-R. I have at home on my wall a map I carried ashore on D-Day.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, it's twice the scale of this one. I've got all the beaches marked on it.
1 to 50,000 yours is.
Yes. Collection of cartoons, huh?
Yes, with the visitors, that's one of the most popular things at the museum, I think. These are mostly on the, well, you get to the front of it on the heart attack. His first heart attack, I think, was the problem. Then, of course, the political thing here made. Someone asked me the other day when they were in here if we didn't have any cartoons that were not favorable to General Eisenhower, and I said I didn't. In the whole collection we've got, I don't think we've got very many. There may be one or two, but none in here. Most of these are reflecting the interest of the people in this. That's a speech.
You can see how those displayed because I have the same problem.
Well, it is a problem too, General, to keep the interest up, especially of the casual visitor who comes in here. We're going to try to work out something better when we get our extension on this building, which will give us a little more flexibility and be able to change a lot of these displays that haven't been changed for many years.
They're a lot more show.
Yes, they. Good deal. This there, and another tour that he made. It's a visit to Seattle in '47 up there, and Mexico, we have a large number of gifts before and while he was president from Mexico. It's there again. Yes. You have keys to the city too. You got that?
I have
a segment of those. Yeah. I think everybody who attains any prominence with keys to the city. This is a rather interesting exhibit for the young people. These baseballs were all signed and given to General Eisenhower. Each one of the major league teams there.
Do you have a gold pass to all the games?
Yes, sir. In the other room, we have all the gold passes too to just about everything. That's a rather interesting item. The pen that Mark Clark used to sign the Korean armistice and sent it over to the president.
Certainly haven't displayed very well.
Well, we keep keep working away at it. It's a never-ending task, of course, because now we have so many different materials to work with and whatnot that we didn't have before.
Play those because they take up so much room?
Yes, that's right. That particular case, of course, came out of the White House. I think that was one of the general's favorite pieces of furniture. He had that in the White House, and
That was in the
yes,
upstairs Oval.
you remember that, General Goodpaster.
Beautiful
We decided we couldn't do any better with it than just put it up the way it was and try to...
Fine, shadow
This way, they
box.
take up a lot of room.
Yes. And this presentation sword, too, from the Netherlands is a rather interesting thing. It's though, it's beautiful, yes. It's over here. We've got one of the more historic pieces in the whole place, and something you may be familiar with. The planning table around which General Eisenhower sat. I'm sure you may have seen that before in its original condition.
Can you perhaps recall for us who sat where at this table?
No, I can't. I don't even remember.
You know, that's one of our next projects, to diagram that out and try to pin down who was where on that, right around the table. We can do it because we have the photographs taken at various periods around there.
How close were you to this meeting?
He used that on many occasions, of course. You're talking about the decision for D
Yes,
going
sir.
on D-Day. I was down in the harbor on a cruiser, waiting to see whether I'd go or get off.
All right, when this meeting was taking place.
Yes.
And I
He
know...
consulted primarily the weatherman, you know. That was a man he had to get the most of his information from.
No, you were all ready to go, though.
All ready to go. I was on board.
I know it's been so many years since D-Day, but could you tell us your first thoughts when they said for you to go? When you got the word from the weatherman, the general said, okay, let's do it.
My first reaction was that the weather looks awful bad for it. Waves were high, and I was afraid we would have trouble getting ashore. In fact, we did lose a lot of tanks trying to get ashore with the floating tanks, you know. They wouldn't take it. That's what I was afraid of. But we solved that by running the LSTs and the LCTs right up on the beach and running them right off on the shore.
His interest in Steuben glass is represented in that case over there, and then also in this other case that commemorates the Nautilus occasion, and more decorations. Those are the passes. Those are the gold passes to just about everything. A very kind of select credit card, I suppose.
Did you visit the White House often, General?
Not too often. I have to go into the executive part. Yes, not that part.
Remember the last time you met with General Eisenhower socially at the White House?
Yes. He had our class of 1915 in there for a dinner. And I remember we had a picture taken afterwards. I have a copy of that.
How many members of the class were present, do you know?
I wouldn't know offhand. I'd guess about 40.
Did you reminisce about the old days?
Oh, yes. Always do. When Ike and I get together, we reminisce all the time.
I've tried to move that piece all over this museum. The tourists invariably have polished the nose on it, no matter where you put it.
Something about the good luck sign.
Yeah, I guess that's
One to
right.
me at West Point, right at the foot of the stairs where the cadets go up to the academic board of the superintendent. And it's gotten around that it's good luck to rub Bradley's nose, and my nose is shining.
I see.
It's something to have to do with
Is that-
that.
is
I don't
that
know what
some-
this happens to be, but it's probably something like that.
Well, I'm sure it's the same thing. Is that some tradition?
It's something that's grown up there.
I wonder if other generals, the busts of other generals, had their noses rubbed.
I don't know. Mine happens to be in a convenient place. Going up to the superintendent's office. When they go up there, it's usually serious.
I see. You've been sent for.
Yes.
General, in terms of American military men and so forth, famous generals in this country, where would Mr. Eisenhower rank, do you think?
Well, he'd be right up at the top, I think.
He would be, do you think, the greatest soldier of this country?
Well, he certainly commanded the largest force of anybody. Pretty hard to downgrade General Washington because he had a different problem. But as far as the size of the force and the victories won, well, I think you've got to put General Eisenhower up near the top.
General Omar Bradley, one of General Eisenhower's closest associates in the victory in Europe, as he toured for the first time the Eisenhower Museum at Abilene, Kansas, where now in about an hour and a half's time, the remains of General Eisenhower will be laid to their final rest. The schedule for the morning, in about 5 minutes from now, there at Abilene, a helicopter should be arriving, bringing President Nixon, Mrs. Nixon, and their daughter Patricia from Washington by way of Salina Air Base, where they transferred from the Air Force One jet to that helicopter. They will remain in Abilene about 2 hours until the conclusion of the services, and then return by helicopter to the Air Force One at Salina and on then to Florida for the Easter weekend. The casket is to be transferred from the train to the hearse at 9:55 Abilene time, Eastern, that's Central Standard Time. That's about a half hour from now. At 10:15, the family departs for the library, all of these Central Standard Time. In approximately 40 minutes from then, the family will arrive at the library. When they depart for the library, it will be their first appearance as they leave their special train at the Abilene Railway Yards. At 11 o'clock Abilene time, noon Eastern Standard Time, the funeral service at the library. That is expected to take about 25 minutes, after which they depart for the chapel, the interment to come at 11:30 Abilene time, 12:30 Eastern Time. Ceremony there to be completed, it is expected, in about 15 minutes. Earlier, or last night at St. Louis, actually, Edgar Eisenhower, 80-year-old older surviving brother of General Eisenhower, said that he thought, he told newsmen at that time, that Mrs. Eisenhower probably would join her son, she and the General's only son, her and the General's only son, John, in Belgium, where he is to be the ambassador once confirmed and approved. George Herman is in Abilene, and we've heard from him earlier this morning. George, would you like to come in again? George Herman in Abilene. Well, perhaps George may be busy at the moment, but we'll get back to him shortly. We see the door of the so-called place of meditation, which is the chapel, this limestone, very simple chapel there in Abilene, and the walk down to it, lined by the honor guard from all of the armed services. Down this path will be carried the casket to the interment. In the floor of the chapel, there in the center, already buried there is the small child of the Eisenhowers, their first child, who died very early in life as a baby, the age of 3, and is buried there in the chapel. The day in Abilene is, as you see, quite clear, although, as George reported to us earlier, it is also quite chilly. The large crowd in Abilene is, of course, comes from around the world. Whether any of the most noted of the international dignitaries have traveled to Abilene for the service, we have not been advised. It was thought that they probably would not. They attended the principal funeral services, the state services at the Washington Cathedral in Washington on Monday. President Nixon, as we've said, is flying there to Abilene, however, and we understand that former President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson expect to be at Abilene as well. Abilene has been a very busy city in the last 4 days since General Eisenhower's death on Friday. There have been scores of Army staff cars and trucks with equipment and with men roaring through the small streets of Abilene. The television equipment being installed, cables laid and microwaved, dishes being mounted, the newsmen coming in and the telegraph lines and teletype lines being brought in to the city to handle the heavy load of traffic as the entire world watches these last few hours of the services for General Eisenhower. And now I'm told that George Herman is ready in Abilene. George?
Yes, Walter. The audience mourners has gathered here in front of the Eisenhower Library at the Eisenhower Center. What you're looking at now is, of course, the honor guard of soldiers and sailors, mixed honor guard that leads from the Eisenhower Library down to the chapel, the place of meditation, as the president usually preferred to call it, a totally non-denominational place, really, of meditation. It is not a church. There is no sign of any denomination, not even a crucifix on the wall. It is strictly a place for the traveler to stop and pause and think. The only religious item, so to speak, of any kind in it is the tablet, the engraved tablet, which bears the words of President Eisenhower's prayer from his first inaugural address. And just by that, the small plaque which commemorates the fact that the President's infant son, Dowd Eisenhower, who died at the age of 3, that small child that the President was so fond of, whom he nicknamed Icky, is buried there, and that the President and Mrs. Eisenhower had expressed a desire some 2 or 3 years ago to be buried there under the floor of the chapel with their son, Dowd. That was the first real idea that the people of Abilene had, that Dwight D. Eisenhower wanted to come back to his hometown for the last time and be buried here. Up until then, it was an open question. Nobody knew whether he wanted to be buried in Gettysburg or in Florida. But once that word was passed and the body of Dowd was brought from Denver to Abilene, it became what the town of Abilene rather proudly calls its best-kept secret. Everybody in Abilene knew that the president was going to be buried here, but they didn't talk about it because it was not, as they put it, an announced story. It was not an announced fact, and they tended to keep it secret from outsiders, thinking that if Mr. Eisenhower wanted to maintain his privacy in that fashion, that was certainly his privilege. The people of Abilene have reacted to all of this bustle and excitement with really a fantastic calm, a great capacity for helping out all of us strange visitors here, and a great calm. Dave Shoemaker down at the station where the train is. Dave, have you not noticed the same thing?
George, I would agree with you, in fact, go beyond that. For all of the impact that Abilene seems to have had on Dwight Eisenhower has really, other than for the establishment of the Eisenhower Center, not had that much impact on the city itself. They accept the famous man quite calmly here and have through all the years. And you don't notice the kinds of souvenir shops, the paraphernalia that seems to be present in so many other towns that have been the hometowns of famous men. I guess it fits in, though, when you consider Mr. Eisenhower's own modesty about his accomplishments. And the Eisenhowers, when the general was alive, used to try to slip into town quietly. Sometimes they would stay at the railroad siding where the funeral train now rests, and they would remain on that campaign car, that special car, and other times they would stay overnight at the Sunflower Hotel just about a block away. But very frequently their comings and goings here have been unpublicized and quiet, and that's the way both sides liked it.
Yes, on one occasion, Dave, I remember President Eisenhower came to town and told some of his friends, this was related to me by one of his friends, Henry Jamison, the publisher of the local newspaper here, that he would like no attention paid to him. And so the word was circulated, and people avoided going up to him in the street, avoided shaking his hands, sort of pretended he wasn't there. And as you say, that was the way at least Mr. Eisenhower wanted it. He met only with his friends, his close friends among the people of Abilene. And now we learn that President Nixon's plane, Air Force One, has landed in Salina, nearby. That's perhaps 20 miles away. And Mr. Nixon will be making his way here also to attend these ceremonies for the burial of President Eisenhower. What you are looking at, once again, is the back view of the mourners gathered in front of the steps of the library. The honor guard on the sidewalk to the left in your screen, that is the path up which the casket will be borne by the pallbearers. Mrs. Eisenhower will, according to plan, if everything goes according to plan, Mrs. Eisenhower will come in a car which will drive up the sidewalk that leads to the chapel, and will get out of the car right in front of the steps and be able to step out of the car, right up the steps, out of the wind, which sweeping across the cold plains of Kansas here this morning is still pretty chilly. The decision originally had been that if there was what the Army likes to call a wind chill factor of 45, a combination of wind and low temperatures, which is rather unpleasant. If it were below 45, the ceremony would be held indoors, and if it were above 45, it would be held outdoors. And with the sun here this morning, the factor is likely to be considerably above 45. That, once again, the chapel, the sidewalk down which Mrs. Eisenhower will, in theory, if all goes according to plan, will drive in her car, and then the car will back down the drive again, and the sidewalk along which the casket will be borne between the rows of soldiers and sailors, members of the Coast Guard, members of the U.S. Marines, and behind them on both sides a long train of flowers and green leaves to make this pathway really more decorative, more memorial, rather than the usual plain grass which is here most of the time. And behind them, out of sight of the camera from this particular angle, behind them, row upon row of wreaths of flowers, some of them saying simply Ike, some of them with more complicated messages. Some perhaps 85 or more wreaths of flowers have been accumulated here. In spite of the requests of the family that no flowers have been sent, so many people wanted to express their feelings in some way that flowers have been sent, numerous wreaths besides the decorations placed here by the military and by those in charge of the proceedings here. And one interesting note, the cards from these wreaths, the cards which have come with the wreaths of flowers, will be presented to the Eisenhower family by Sergeant James Matthews, three of whose brothers served with, or perhaps it would be more exact to say, served under President Eisenhower in the military. Two of them in Europe, one of them working with General Eisenhower as an alternate driver on his famous visit to Korea after he was elected and before he assumed office. Sergeant Matthews will present the cards from the flowers to the member of the Eisenhower family who elects to receive them, probably to John Eisenhower or to one of his children who will take on this job. And the road not only, now that once again is the small sort of arch which stands before the chapel, and behind it you can just see the wall of the fountain. Very attractive, but small scale fountain in keeping with the chapel, which is really rather a small and unpretentious building in the background. And the sort of triple pillars of the arch have been decorated this morning, not their usual rather mild Kansas limestone appearance, but they've been decorated in stripes of red, white, and blue, giving a cast of color as you look down the sidewalk from the Eisenhower Library here towards the chapel. That's the situation now as we wait here at the Eisenhower Library, Walter.
Of the 5 Eisenhower brothers who were brought up in that clapboard house at East 4th and South Cuney Streets in Abilene, Kansas, there are now 2 survivors. Edgar Eisenhower, who is 80 years old and is aboard the train and has been greeting the crowds that have come out to watch the train pass through many of the small towns across America. And the other brother surviving is Dr. Milton Eisenhower, President Emeritus of Johns Hopkins University, who felt ill on Monday afternoon before the services at the Washington Cathedral and was taken to Walter Reed Hospital, where today he's reported in satisfactory condition, although still undergoing tests. The nature of his illness and whether it is serious or not has not been revealed as yet. He, however, is not able to make the services there at Abilene today. A 10-car special train arrived in Abilene this morning about 50 minutes, about 9 hours late. It actually left Washington about 50 minutes behind schedule as it pulled out of Washington's Union Station. Its first stop was at Charlottesville, Virginia. The Eisenhower family had requested that there be no special observances at the stations that the train would pass through. But later there were people who turned out at White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, to say farewell. And the scene was repeated at practically all the stations. The train continued its trip on through Ohio, across the Mississippi, on to Abilene. CBS News correspondent Ed Rabel reports from Huntington.
The train moved slowly into the station, running about 10 minutes behind schedule. Onlookers strained to see the car in which General Eisenhower's body was being borne. A brief memorial service had been scheduled and was conducted while a crew change was made, the purpose of the stop here.
General Eisenhower stood as a landmark and a bulwark of faith in a time when the walls of our society was crumbling all about us. And the transition was swift and alarming, and we seemed to have lost our way. In the day when we have learned to swim through the water like the fish, fly through the air like the birds, he showed us how to walk on this earth as men ought to walk.
And then, as taps were sounded, the people in silence said goodbye to General Eisenhower for the last time. Ed Rabel, CBS News, Huntington, West Virginia.
This is Bill Plant in Cincinnati. It rained from low clouds as the funeral train sped through the winding Ohio Valley, making up some lost time. But the weather did not deter the hundreds of people from coming to the right-of-way to say their farewells. In towns like Ashland and Russell and Maysville, Kentucky, the crowds were solemn. They carried flags and their veterans presented arms as the train rolled through. And there would have been more ceremony had time and the wishes of the family permitted. As the train neared Cincinnati, there were small knots of people waiting along the tracks which were patrolled by police. But when the train came to the Cincinnati Union Terminal for a 1-hour switching and service layover, there was no one to greet it. Ceremonies had been canceled and the terminal building closed. But Mrs. Eisenhower, we are told, was particularly moved at the sight of children all along the route, and so at Cincinnati the rest of the schedule was made public. Someone found 100 yards of black crepe, which was hastily applied to the baggage car carrying the general's remains, and a flag was put on the side of the car. Edgar Eisenhower, the general's 80-year-old brother, left the train to say his thanks and to explain the family's feelings.
A little difficult to express exactly how you feel when you see the tribute that's paid to a member of your family by thousands and thousands of people. I personally am almost speechless in an effort to tell you how I personally feel. I think the family is bearing up well under all of the conditions, and I just appreciate the attitude of the people that have lined the driveways and the railways as we've come across country.
Mr. Eisenhower, how is Mrs. Eisenhower?
She's feeling better. She's gradually getting a hold of herself. It's a shock, and they were so close together during their life that it's understandable that she's lost, as it were.
As the funeral train pulled out of Cincinnati, a few minutes late, there were still those who had waited to watch. The shades of the last car, the family car, remained tightly drawn as the train headed outward to the plains, and to the many more people waiting to say goodbye.
In St. Louis last night, it was different. 1,500 people there. The local high school band played. No one expected her to appear, but Mrs. Eisenhower came forward as the train backed in. She appeared touched and moved by the people and their expression of sympathy. Again and again, she formed the words, "Thank you and God bless you." Some in the crowd were not that strong. After a while, Mrs. Eisenhower's grandson, David, came to stand beside her. The St. Louis stop lasted nearly an hour, and then the funeral train was off again, back along a route that General Eisenhower traveled 60 years ago when he left Kansas to go east to West Point and then on to greatness. There were no crowds, only a few policemen and some trainmen and workers and a handful of reporters. The time was 3:40 in the morning. The train was running hours late. The scattering of citizens that waited so very long were not permitted to come to Track 22 at Union Station, Kansas City. No ceremonies were planned. This was just a 15-minute stop to check the brakes and to put on some water and to fix the flag on the side of the car bearing the body.
Washington, Indiana, on that long trip across the country, 10 to 15,000 persons, it was said, turned out in a city that counts a population of 11,000. And there, Indiana's Governor Edgar Whitcomb sent aboard the train red geraniums for Mrs. Eisenhower. And at Salem, Illinois, there were 4,000 persons just at dusk, and there, while the train did not stop, it passed slowly through the town. Mrs. Eisenhower again appeared briefly on the rear platform. All along the route, farmers and in West Virginia in the very early hours of the morning, kids in their pajamas, and women carrying small flags, crowds that broke into spontaneous song, as we recall they did during the Robert Kennedy funeral train's passage from New York to Washington last year. There were, again, those who manufactured for themselves a small souvenir of this occasion by placing coins on the track of the train, letting the train flatten them and to save them as a remembrance of this occasion. There in Abilene, they're waiting in another 10 minutes, it is expected. The Eisenhower family will disembark from the last coach on the train for the ride over to the museum and to the services. General Eisenhower once stood at his family home there in Abilene and looked to the wide sweep of the plains and the rolling hills out of Abilene and said, "This is the most beautiful region under God's blue sky." It was then he made the decision, presumably, that that was where he was coming back for his final resting place. CBS News White House correspondent Dan Rather is in Abilene with George Herman. Gentlemen.
Walter, this is George. Dan is here with me, and we're sitting, as we've remarked before, in front of the Eisenhower Library, one of a large number of what are coming to be presidential libraries, a number of which Dan Rather has already seen. Have you not, Dan?
Well, George, of course, this library is bigger than that of President Harry Truman in Independence, Missouri, I believe, although both, to the naked eye, appear to be roughly the same size. Neither, we're told, is as large as the library now under construction and in preparation, the Lyndon B. Johnson Library in Austin, Texas. This library, the Eisenhower Library, appears quite large, for one thing, because it's situated on this very flat land that, if you haven't been to Kansas in a while, the thing that strikes you as you arrive here on this blue sky, sunny but cold day is how flat this country is, this one-time frontier country where General Eisenhower was born.
One of the things that's rather interesting, perhaps a trifle ironic about it, is that the Congress passed what is called the Presidential Library Law in President Eisenhower's term in office. I think it was 1955, making it at that time retroactive so it could include President Roosevelt's museum at Hyde Park and the Truman Library at Independence. The act said the president could choose a site for the library, and usually it is then built by private subscription from his friends and so forth, and then it is turned over to the federal government. It goes to the department, to the archives, the National Archives, which assumes control of it, the National Archives in turn being part of the General Services Administration, so that while this started out as a private sort of charitable foundation project, it is now turned into a government office. And of course it was started, this library was started before President Eisenhower was president. The foundation was formed, as I recall, in 1945 by a group of friends. And they asked permission to form a library in his name, a foundation in his name, and to take over some grounds. And he gave permission only with a certain amount of reluctance and only with the understanding that the library, or whatever was to be built by the foundation, would be dedicated not just to him but to all his comrades at arms. Now it looks like the procession is beginning to form at the railroad station. Can you give us a report from there, Dave Shoemaker?
Yes, George. In the past few minutes, some of those who have ridden this train across the country have disembarked to leave both for your site and also to get ready to board the limousines. In the back, we have seen Julie Nixon Eisenhower. To the front where you're looking now, they are forming the clergy and the honorary pallbearers. General Bradley, Admiral Anderson, General Collins, and the others. General Goodpaster, of course, having replaced Dr. Milton Eisenhower, who will not be here. We expect the president to arrive shortly. There is a limousine at the last car, which is the campaign car that was used by the Eisenhowers for so many years. Mrs. Eisenhower apparently will leave the train there and board that automobile and then be driven up to her place in this cortege. So much of President Eisenhower's life revolved around just these few feet of track. Not only his first train ride and his first ride out of town to Topeka and then later to West Point, but of course he came here as a hero from World War II for one of many parades that was given in his honor. A day in which he admitted that every boy dreams of the day when he comes back home after making good. He too dreamed, but his dreams have been exceeded beyond the wildest stretch of the imagination. And then just to the back of this railroad station, the Plaza Theater, where President Eisenhower, then still a candidate, held his first news conference. Nearby, a lumber yard where he helped form steel bins, one of his early jobs. And then just about a block away, the Bell Springs Creamery, where both Mr. Eisenhower's father worked as a mechanic and then he himself worked after graduation from high school in order to help his brother through college and then to save money for his own college education. This point, too, was at one time the termination of the Chisholm Trail and may have played a part in Dwight Eisenhower's early love of the West. The color guard is now in position, and the body bearers have boarded the train to replace the special honor guard that has been standing over the casket as it has crossed the country. 2 teams of body bearers needed. One to take the casket to the door of the baggage car, and then the second to carry it the short distance to the waiting hearse. After the number of changes in temperatures that we have gone through during the course of the morning, it is again warm, and the crowd of several thousand, though not so large as was expected, has finally been able to get warm enough and no longer has to stamp their feet and pound their shoulders to keep warm. And now the procession seems to be in order and readiness, waiting only now for the arrival of President Nixon. Traveling with the Eisenhower train across the country, besides the widow, her son, daughter-in-law, Mr. Sergeant and Mrs. John Money, who was, of course, Mr. Eisenhower's longtime military aide, one brother, Edgar, two other of John Eisenhower's daughters, Dr. Kevin McCann, the president of Defiance College, a man who helped President Eisenhower with many of his speeches. A few moments ago, we saw General Leonard Heaton leave the train. He and Mrs. Heaton traveled this route. General Heaton was the head of the medical team at Walter Reed Medical Center, which saw Mr. Eisenhower through so many crises. A few moments ago, before this procession began to form, some friends of Mr. and Mrs. Eisenhower boarded the train near the back of the sections and then walked through the train, apparently going forward to the baggage car to pay their own moments of final respect.
David?
And now we see the president's car. Yes, George?
I was just going to say that we had seen what appeared to be the presidential helicopter landing some moments ago, and whether you saw the president's car inside, and you do, so continue. I understand, though, that ex-President Johnson has also landed by helicopter.
That is our understanding, too. Neither man is here yet, although we see this motorcade drawing up now with the presidential flag on the first car, obviously Mr. Nixon. And they're just a few blocks away now. Here at trainside, David and Julie Eisenhower have left the train and are moving forward to their positions. And you can see coming down the streets of Abilene a presidential motorcade, the Secret Servicemen, the Outriders. The baggage car door, the wide door, has opened, and we can just see inside the flag-draped casket and the body bearers waiting for the beginning of the ceremony. An honor guard from the 24th Infantry Division at Fort Riley, Kansas, is standing by. And while most of the soldiers that are here and on duty today have come from the surrounding area for the more ceremonial functions, particularly the handling of the president's casket, they have flown in the special units from Washington, the military district of Washington. And now, at trainside, the presidential motorcade has arrived. The crowd standing very quietly. Not many of them have a very good view. They are about a half a block away from the train and the large press bleachers that has been set up is between them and what you're able to see now.
David, it must be quite a shock for the people of Abilene to learn what it is to have a president of the United States visit their small town. I gather that the Secret Service made house-to-house visits along the entire route that the president would be traveling today, both to the train side and away from train side, back to the points at which services will be held, and then back to the helicopter again. That must have been something of a interesting experience for them as the Secret Service checked out their homes and their firearms and their backgrounds even.
You're right, Walter. Although, of course, they were used to the idea of the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, so much has happened in the country since then that there is a whole new regimen of security. And security agents for the past several days have been sealing sewers and doorway entrances, forming access lists even of businesses and homes along this route, and this is all very new to them. And of course, the press corps has multiplied tremendously since the days when Mr. Eisenhower was president.
It's rather interesting to think of this security, some 2,400 men of the armed forces there and all the Secret Service and so forth. A strange mark for Abilene, Kansas, which was once, when it was, as you noted, the head of the Chisholm Trail, was a gunslinging western town that was the locale for a lot of those western stories Dwight Eisenhower loved so well. But there we see the presidential family. Back to you, David.
That's right. Mr. Nixon has now left his car. There is another limousine moving forward where we believe that Mr. Johnson is in that limousine, but we can't see from our vantage point right now. It's while Bill Hickok used to be the marshal, patrolled Texas Street, which is just, or was just a few feet away from here. Kept the order. Mr. Eisenhower himself said he saw only one incident of violence in his boyhood, that he had to wait until he was 15 to see a shooting, and apparently the man who was doing the shooting missed. And now John Eisenhower supporting his mother as strongly as he has his father for so many years. And they move to the front of the mourners, about 10 to 15 feet away from the open door of the funeral car. The Nixons, Mr. and Mrs. Nixon and Tricia Nixon, move into position just behind the family. This is the Fifth Army Band, and the hymn is God of Our Fathers.
Save them. For the closing of the halves, we'll keep you apprised as to the timeouts remaining. Ball just between right on the 26-yard line, a little closer to the 26. 2 minutes and 5 seconds remaining. Unofficial time indicated in the scoreboard clock.
saw all of